I never thought I would have to choose between keeping the peace in my family and protecting my own child, but that's exactly what happened, and it started with something so small that I almost missed it. My mother-in-law Barbara had always been the kind of woman who had an opinion about everything. How I cooked, how I dressed, how I kept the house. Nothing was ever quite right in her eyes. But I had learned to live with that over the years because my husband Daniel loved her deeply, and because most of the time her comments were just comments. Annoying, yes. Harmful, no. Or at least that's what I thought. We had one daughter, Mia. She was 6 years old, bright and curious and full of energy, and Barbara adored her completely. That part was never in question. The problem was that Barbara's love came with conditions I had never agreed to. Her own ideas about how a little girl should behave, what she should eat, what she should believe, how she should speak. And for a long time I didn't realize just how far those ideas were going because Barbara was careful. Very careful. It started when Mia came home from an afternoon at Barbara's house and sat down at the dinner table and refused to eat the vegetables on her plate. That alone wasn't unusual. She was 6, vegetables were never her favorite. But what she said next stopped me cold. She looked at me and said, "Grandma says I don't have to eat things I don't like. She says only mean mommies force their kids to eat." I put my fork down very slowly. I looked at Daniel. He looked at his plate. I told Mia calmly that Grandma had her own opinions and that in our house we had our own rules. Mia accepted that easily enough. She was 6, she moved on quickly. But I didn't move on. I sat with that comment all evening, turning it over in my mind, because something about it felt like more than just a grandmother spoiling her grandchild. It felt deliberate. I brought it up with Daniel that night after Mia was asleep. He listened and then he said what he always said. "She means well. You know how she is. Don't make it into something bigger than it is." And I wanted to believe him. I really did. So I let it go. But then it happened again. 2 weeks later Mia came home from another visit and told me at bedtime that Grandma had shown her how to say a prayer before sleeping. Now I want to be clear here because this matters. Daniel and I had made a very specific decision early in our marriage that we would not raise Mia in any particular religion. We had talked about it seriously, we had agreed on it together, and we had communicated that decision clearly to both our families. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't ambiguous. It was a boundary we had both set. And Barbara knew that. She had heard it directly from Daniel more than once. I asked Mia to show me the prayer. She did, word for word, with her little hands folded exactly the way Barbara had taught her. And then she said, "Grandma says God watches over little girls who pray. She says it's our special secret." Our special secret. Those 3 words hit me like cold water. Because a grandmother teaching a child something behind her parents' backs is one thing. But teaching a child to keep it secret, that's something else entirely. That's not love. That's manipulation. I didn't say anything to Mia that night except that I was glad she told me. I tucked her in, turned off the light, and went to the living room where Daniel was watching television. I sat down next to him and I said very quietly, very calmly, "We need to talk about your mother. And this time I need you to actually listen." He muted the television. And for the first time in a long time he didn't immediately defend her. I told him about the prayer. I told him about the secret. I watched his face go through several different expressions: surprise, discomfort, and then something that looked a lot like concern. He said, "Are you sure she said secret?" And I said, "Daniel, our 6-year-old daughter demonstrated the prayer for me word for word. She was proud of it. And she specifically said Grandma told her not to tell us." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll talk to her." I said, "I know you will. But this time I want to be there when you do." He agreed. And I could tell from the way he said it that something had shifted in him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough for me to feel like we were finally on the same side of this. We called Barbara the next evening and asked her to come over. I had thought carefully about how I wanted to handle it. Not with accusations, not with anger, but with complete clarity. I had spent years softening my words around Barbara, choosing the diplomatic version of every sentence. And where had that gotten me? My daughter was learning prayers in secret, and being told that her mother was mean for making her eat vegetables. Diplomacy had run its course. Barbara arrived looking perfectly pleasant, the way she always did. A small woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile that didn't always reach them. She kissed me on the head, complimented my living room, and sat down on the sofa like this was any other visit. Mia was in her room with a movie, which I had arranged on purpose. This conversation was not for her ears. I let Daniel start. He sat across from his mother and said, "Mom, we need to talk about some things that have been happening during your visits with Mia." Barbara looked at him with that particular expression she had, attentive, slightly wounded in advance, as if she already knew she was being accused of something and was already preparing her defense. Daniel told her about the vegetables comment first. Barbara smiled and waved her hand and said, "Oh, that was just a joke. Children don't need to be forced to eat. It creates psychological problems. I read an article." Daniel said it wasn't about the vegetables specifically, it was about contradicting our parenting in front of Mia. Barbara's smile stayed in place, but her eyes went a little flat. Then Daniel told her about the prayer. The smile didn't disappear exactly. It just changed. Became something more careful. She said, "I simply shared something meaningful with my granddaughter. Is that a crime? I'm her grandmother." Daniel said, "Mom, you told her to keep it secret from us." Barbara opened her mouth and then closed it again. And in that small silence I saw the moment she realized she couldn't explain that part away. I spoke then. I had been quiet up until that point, and I think Barbara had been counting on that, on me staying quiet the way I usually did. I looked at her and I said, "Barbara, I don't doubt that you love Mia. That's not what this is about. What this is about is that Daniel and I made a decision together about how we want to raise our daughter, and you knew about that decision and you chose to go around it anyway. And then you asked her to keep a secret from her own parents. That's the part one can't let go of." Barbara looked at Daniel like she was waiting for him to rescue her. He didn't. He just sat there and let my words stand, which was honestly more than I had expected from him, and I felt something settle in my chest because of it. Barbara said, "I just wanted to give her something. Something from me. Something that was ours." And her voice cracked slightly on that last word, and I could see that she meant it, that underneath all of it there was a real feeling. A grandmother who was afraid of being irrelevant, of being kept at a distance, of losing her place in her granddaughter's life. I understood that. I even felt for her in that moment. But understanding someone's feelings doesn't mean accepting their behavior. I said, "You can absolutely have something that's yours with Mia. You can bake with her and read to her and tell her stories about Daniel when he was little and take her to the park and teach her to knit if she's interested. There is so much space for you in her life, Barbara. But that space has to exist inside the boundaries that Daniel and I set. Not around them. Not instead of them. Inside them." The room was quiet for a moment. Barbara looked down at her hands. Then she looked up at Daniel and said, "Is this how you feel too?" And Daniel said, "Yes, Mom. It is." She nodded slowly. She didn't apologize exactly. That wasn't really Barbara's way, but she said, "I hear you." And then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "I didn't think you'd notice." I looked at her and said, "I always notice. I'm her mother." We sat together for another hour after that. The conversation moved into quieter territory. Barbara asked about Mia's school, Daniel made tea, and somewhere in the middle of all of it the tension began to settle into something more manageable. Not resolved completely, not perfectly repaired, but different. More honest than it had been before. When Barbara left that evening, she hugged Daniel at the door, and then she turned to me and held out her hand. Not a hug, just her hand. I shook it, and she said, "You're a good mother." Just that. For words, no elaboration. I said, "Thank you, Barbara." She walked down the path to her car, and I stood in the doorway watching her go, and Daniel came and stood beside me and put his arm around my shoulders. Mia appeared from the hallway in her pajamas, completely unaware of everything that had just happened, and said, "Is Grandma gone? Can I have a snack?" Daniel laughed. I laughed. And I went to the kitchen to get my daughter a snack because that's what you do, you handle the hard thing and then life just continues right there where you left it.